Well, thank you for joining me once again as we move into our fourth study in this study of the book of James, the series entitled Maturing in the Faith. And we've already encountered some tremendous teaching from James, and I look forward to all he stands ready to teach us through the remainder of his book. Our topic of study today is entitled Testing and Temptation Are Not the Same. And we find our text passage in James chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. Join me as we read today's passage together. A man who endures trials is blessed, because when he passes the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. No one undergoing a trial should say, I am being tempted by God. For God is not tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own evil desires. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. An interesting read concerning temptation can be found within the pages of C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters. This particular book was a part of my required reading in the English literature class that I took back in my Bible college days. When Lewis wrote The Screwtape Letters, many found themselves to be quite impressed by his insights into the dynamics of temptation. They assumed he had done many years of theological study to be so prepared to tackle this subject. But in response to these, Lewis referred them to Psalm 36:1 to discover his true response to them. Notice his response. He declared, "They forget that there is an equally reliable, though less credible way of learning how temptation works." And then, of course, the verse, my heart. And Lewis says, I need no other. My heart showeth me the wickedness of the ungodly. Think about that for a moment. My heart shows me the wickedness of the ungodly. Now, it's important to understand that God does send testing and trials, but he only allows temptations. Let me say that again. God does send testing and trials, but he only allows temptations. God himself, being utterly holy and righteous, cannot be tempted, and so, as verse 13 tells us, he does not tempt us to sin. While testing comes from outside sources, temptations come from within the heart. It is a fact that our own sinful desires entice us to disobey God, as verse 14 clearly indicates here for us. Now, when we give in to these enticements, we find ourselves being drawn away by them, according to the scripture. Now, I want you to notice how forceful and even somewhat violent the language is that James is using to make his point well known, to drive this point home. He refers to prey being pursued and caught by a ruthless hunter. Yielding to temptation stands in stark contrast to enduring testing and trials. On the one hand, evil desires result in sin, and the consequence is death, according to verse 15. And it's ironic that James uses the language of growth here. He begins with conception and childbearing, and this is used to describe this genesis of sin. On the other hand, though, perseverance or endurance results in spiritual growth that leads to a maturing faith, as we had seen earlier in verses 2 through 4 of James chapter 1. This is a very different growth process. For those who persevere under trial, God has promised the special blessing of a crown of life. James was most likely referring to the victory laurel that was presented to winning athletes or to conquering generals. God's promise, however, involves an eternal reward that is far more valuable than any kind of earthly riches. Part of gaining the wisdom that was referred to back in verse 5 then is understanding the clear-cut choice we have between one path that leads to death and the other that leads to life. Now, this choice of two paths motif occurs often in Scripture. We have a very familiar example of this presented to us in Psalm chapter 1, and I want to share that for you, and I want you to think about this and what the psalmist writes. Beginning with verse 1, he writes, "How happy is the man who does what? Who does not follow the advice of the wicked or take the path of sinners or join a group of mockers. Instead, his delight is in the Lord's instruction, and he meditates on it day and night. He is like a tree that's planted beside streams of water that bears its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers." Notice the change here. The wicked aren't like this. Instead, they are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not survive the judgment, and sinners will not be in the community of the righteous. Verse 6, "For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to ruin." You know, it's interesting. The first three verses, the path of a righteous person is being described, while in the next two, we find a description of the path of the wicked. Verse 6 brings it all together in a summary that shares with us the outcomes or the consequences for each path's choice. Something to definitely think about and consider as you go about your day today. Until next time.